Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. We believe when the people of God do the work of God in unity, it's evangelistic. People want to know Jesus when we're doing that. So that's why Jesus tells us, make disciples, people who are willing to disadvantage themselves to serve others, to fix our communities and the world, and get the opportunity to share Jesus. So on our podcast, we talk about issues of God and culture to increase understanding, accelerate our ability to make disciples, do justice, and share Jesus to transform New England. I've got a special guest with us today, although we are usually a triumvirate the last what day is it? Thursday. Sorry, the last Thursday of the month. It's usually the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond, who is with us. He's the senior pastor at Bethel AME in Jamaica Plain. And we normally have Pastor Enoch Lau with us from Boston Chinese Evangelical Church. Enoch had a scheduling conflict that he could not rearrange. And so he apologized and said he was really disappointed to miss today's conversation. But today's conversation is not an easy one, so he may have a different view by the time we're done. This is, as our regular listeners know, we have a focus on racial understanding and reconciliation on our podcast, in part because we're called to be peacemakers. And to make peace, you need to understand other perspectives to answer that call. And so, but we're also called to do justice, and we need to engage enough to determine what are the injustices in our society and what do we do about them. And because every domestic issue today has a component of it that connects to race. And if we cede then the dialogue around race, we're leaving it to people who are not going to be informed by the gospel and the Holy Spirit and will not get to the right answer. But we also want to practice arriving at our political choices from our theology and model for the world that we can disagree in respect, kindness, and winsomeness. And just imagine the witness to the world and the evangelistic impact if in the church we had complete harmony and unity across racial divides while the world is fighting with each other about it. And so we want to carve out a niche in our conversation when it comes to race that avoids lecturing people, but also avoids happy talk. Avoids demonizing people and helps us break out of our silos and really engage with each other as people made in the image of God, who can challenge each other in a safe place and still love and respect each other. And maybe we even persuade each other, but as I always joke, I get paid whether anybody agrees with me or not. So I don't try to persuade. But if there's something you hear today that you don't agree with or doesn't feel right or sense right, I'd encourage you to hang in there, because you'll probably hear other things too that maybe will help clarify that point. But may just help in understanding each other so that we can have unity of the church. Today, of course, this week is the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. So we're talking about police violence and shootings in particular, and the racial implications that are all around that. This is a difficult topic. It's a dangerous topic. Since challenging in this area, which is what we want to do, risks people getting angry, risks being canceled, accused, attacked by the social media mobs. And we think in the church, we should be able to avoid that kind of thing. So we want to have that conversation. We see more and more that Americans are divided, and we see the world differently. And that's true when it comes to law enforcement too. And that's intertwined with race. But what we always start with is first, Ray, thanks for joining us again.
Great to be here as always.
You're a glutton for punishment. I think we're going to stop calling you a guest and call you a contributor or something like they do on the news show. But we always want to start with, what's the biblical basis or framework of why we as believers should care about this issue, engage in this issue? How do you think about that, Ray?
Thanks again for the opportunity to be here, and of course to Bob, who keeps us all on point and makes this all possible behind the scene, and in his absence, Enoch. I think we're here obviously because I think the issue of justice matters deeply. I know certainly in my more traditional upbringing, we often talked about righteousness in the church, but not enough about the justice side of that, which is very overt in the biblical context, very overt in the Hebrew language and so on. But we've made a distinction between the two in the church that I think has been costly for us in terms of focusing on what we consider personal righteousness, but not addressing the larger issues of justice, both in relationships, in communities, and of course across legal and political systems and so on. So because we care about justice and in many respects, policing, law enforcement, criminal justice are a very significant part of that. Obviously not the only thing, but a significant part of it. And I, particularly over the past few years, I've worked with police departments, police officers for 30 years in a number of different contexts, both in some cases really trying to be supportive. I think it's one of the most stressful and difficult jobs going. Partnerships in the early days, we were church planters, and in the early days, one of our first community outreaches was done in partnership with the Police Athletic League. I've had police officers as part of my congregation and part of my church leadership. And as we were doing work with proven risk kids in Boston as part of what came to be known as the Boston Miracle in the 1990s, and since then, police officers have been at the center of that. So it's been a real blessing and privilege to work with people who had a deep sense, in many cases, I'd say, of real ministry, of really trying to make communities safe, of trying to help prevent, not just punish crime and so on. But we're also aware of the fact that there are serious problems. And the fascinating thing for me is that I see that in many respects reflected in the biblical record. Literally going back through the Old Testament, as you look at the security forces, or those who would have been kind of the police analogs, in some cases coming alongside a Jeremiah, coming alongside other prophetic figures or marginalized or disempowered figures and helping them, and in other cases being the forces of very brutal treatment. You certainly see both, and of course the undergirding message of the prophets constantly calling the nation and the people to justice, particularly on behalf of those who are the poor, the widowed and the orphan, the stranger in your midst, etc. I think it's even stronger in many ways in the New Testament, where for very interesting reasons, the occupations are, the Roman centurions are identified over and over again. And the centurions in that time were the equivalent of our police. And you get to see all sides of this, from the Roman officer of Capernaum whose servant Jesus heals, the Roman officer at the cross who, his fellow officers have done some pretty, I mean, Jesus could have sued for police brutality, right? If you look at the beating that he got, right?
If only he was an American with lawyers
that's exactly
everywhere you
right.
go.
He had every grounds, right? But you also have it there, and there are people there, casting lots for his clothes after they strip him and leave him naked on a cross. But you also have a Roman officer who's kind of watching the whole thing, and you get the sense, listening to what Jesus is saying, and at the end of it saying, surely this was the Son of God. You have the Roman centurion Cornelius, a God-fearer, deeply admired by the surrounding community for his generosity and his caring and his support of the Jewish minority, becoming the one who is to whom Peter is sent in kind of that first excursion by Peter into Gentile territory and evangelism. So over and over again, you encounter these figures, and of course Romans 13, which talks about the importance of those who are committed to the task of keeping order. So I'm impressed that the Bible, I think, really tells the whole story of within the compass of its call to justice and compassion, and recognizing that there's some who do it well and in a manner that you could commend as godly, and others who are the brutal and terrible face of it that has gotten so much attention recently.
And so it's a good point. So that, you know, our exhortation to justice, and you and I know both would talk about biblical justice. We're not talking about a watered down gospel justice, and we're not talking about a political agenda justice, but what God talks about is justice. Says that I should not be unjustly abused by the police.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
And if that's happening, I have an obligation as a believer to stop that from happening to somebody else.
I think we not only have that, we've got the wonderful example of the Apostle Paul in Acts 16, who after he is released, you know, I mean, it's interesting, the people have raised a question around, you know, he's thrown in Philippian jail on essentially trumped-up charges. Yeah. People are upset that he has ended their profitable exploitation of this young girl. They're trafficking her, not in sex, but in this case, in prophetic utterance or, you know, fortune telling. And he interrupts this. You know, he brings it into oppression, which brings it into their line of business, and they falsely accuse him of fomenting rebellion and so on and so on, and they end up being beaten, put into the inner stocks of the prison, etc. I always laugh because I say, you know, the fascinating thing is that the earthquake that takes place in the Philippian jail is really not for Paul and Silas at all. They're actually going to get out the next day anyway. It is for the Philippian jail and for his family, and it directly leads to their, you know, openness to the gospel and willingness to be baptized on the spot. The next day, when they tell Paul, well, you know, those charges don't really stand the smell test, so you guys just move along, no problem here. Fascinating that Paul says, no, you violated our rights. You put your hands on a Roman citizen. You tell the magistrates to come here and apologize themselves. And people have speculated all over the map about why they did that. I don't think it's just a matter of personal pride for Paul. I think it is an insistence on justice being done. And I think it is also, since he's got to leave, a form of leaving some protection for the Philippians who he's leaving behind, this nascent church, and making it clear to people, look, we're not here to cause trouble, but we will insist on being treated fairly. And I want you to know that those Philippians who I'm leaving behind have friends who know what the law is, what the rules are, what the rights are.
And so there's a justice I should expect from a police interaction. But one of the reasons we have the police is to do justice as well, because it's just as unjust if we say, hey, survival of the fittest here, right? You got to take care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Right. And so there's a tension in this. So we tend to talk about one or the other sides, and I do want to try and bring them together in some of our dialogue today, because it's otherwise it's not a whole picture of what's going on. Is, you know, when I talk to pastors, and I want to give you the chance to speak to it before we get too deep in, there's stereotypes of what you, Ray, believe as an African American, what I believe as a white evangelical. And so the assumption is, well, Ray Hammond wants to defund the police. And I don't talk to a single African American pastor or white pastor who thinks that's a good idea. What would you say to that?
Well, you know, it's like a lot of slogans. I don't pay very much attention to it. I really want to know what you're saying. Because defund the police means everything from decrease the police overtime budget, which the city of Boston did, for example, to abolish police altogether. So I have no idea what people mean when they say defund the police, right? I would agree with decreasing the overtime budget. I would agree with carving out, I think, a number of areas that not only I think police don't do very well, police don't think they do it very well. So I don't think they're the best first line when it comes to mental illness. They're not the best first line when it comes to homelessness. They're not the best first line, frankly, when it comes to many school-related problems. And even in some cases, domestic violence. There's a whole series of areas that we've kind of dumped on our police departments. And the evidence, I think, is good, certainly in the case of mental illness, that there are better ways to do this. And actually, the most tragic case we have in the context of mental illness. Doesn't involve an African American at all. It's a white fellow with known mental health problems who ended up getting shot, I think 20 sometimes in Boston. And this could have been handled very differently.
Yeah.
So there are a number of areas that I think, either from societal inertia or police union protection, I don't know all the dynamics of it, that have been kept under the purview of police. And I think it's a poor choice. It's bad because it's too expensive, and it's bad because it's not effective, not nearly as effective as it could be.
Yeah, and there's the whole thing of what training we really provide to you to do it. But in some cases, the training to do this job means you are not going to ever be able to do this job.
Exactly right.
Because they're two different. I'm a technology guy by background, right? And so you can't just say to me, "Hey, we trained you in that, and now we want you to be a social worker today."
That's exactly right. We're asking police to do everything, well, not everything, but too many things. So if defund the police means let's stop asking police to do what I don't think they're very well trained to do, and oh, by the way, as a consequence of that, we are seeing either people hurt and or killed. Let's stop doing that. So again, for me, the issue of defund the police is, what are you talking about here? I mean, what are you asking for? And there are some people, I'm sure, who are saying abolish police altogether. From everything I can see, that's a pretty small number.
Yeah, I think that's right. The what everybody I talk to would say, I think what you're saying is, hey, look, no, don't defund the police, because as one pastor in the Boston area said, our people are the ones who suffer when the police aren't responding properly. He said, now, reform the police, right? There are some things that are broken, just like there's things broken everywhere, and there's some things to fix. And so I want to, before we get too much deeper, I do want to talk historically a little bit.
Sure.
Because I think there may be some things that sometimes I think we think, hey, everybody knows this, but I think in some of the conversations, I mean, that people say, well, I didn't understand that as something that is significant in the African-American experience because it's just not taught in schools and stuff like that. And I think we make a mistake when we assume that history isn't still with us. I've quoted James Baldwin a few times. I think he makes a great point. He says, history doesn't refer to just the past, right? It's the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all we do. The example I always use is we taught our kids how to handle money. I was taught how to handle money by my parents, who learned it from their parents, who survived the Depression. So my kids handle money 4 generations later as if they had something to do with the Depression. And that's still with us. You know, Holocaust survivors, we understand that their children, right, are going to see the world a certain way and have to deal with issues. Children of abuse, right, we see the same thing. So there's these things that don't go away just because that experience isn't here anymore. It's with us and significant. And so what are some things, Ray, you might point to that people might not be as aware of in the African-American experience in our history that kind of inform how they may see or interact with police officers?
Absolutely. And again, this history, I think, goes very deeply. Certainly in the South, not so much in the North, perhaps even in the West, but in the South, police departments in many cases were really seen as being the inheritors of the mantle from the old slave patrols. And so police departments were in the 19th century times and so on, you know, the kind of direct descendants, and this is part of the violence and control you need in a slave society. You know, the problem all the time is that slaves hear the Apostle Paul saying, and if you can get your freedom, do so. And their answer is, let me get my feet moving and get out of here. And owners have to work against that. So in a slave society, slave patrols, the apprehension of fugitive slaves, the beating of slaves, the killing of slaves is part of what is the you know, the status quo. And African Americans remember that very distinctly. They are deeply aware of the fact that even after the abolition of slavery, police departments, sheriffs, local sheriffs, were either aider and abettors or sometimes leaders and primary organizers of the Klan, the domestic terrorists who enforced the new status quo of Jim Crow and segregation. And the experience, even in non-Southern communities and Northern communities, was that police were not there in what were typically often deeply segregated communities. They were not there really for the benefit of the citizens. They were really seen as, in some respects, more commonly, not always, not all police, but many as participants in a kind of occupying army. You add to this the fact that there are now documented the Equal Justice Institute down in Montgomery, Alabama, and there are many other sources, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 lynchings in the United States between kind of the end of Jim Crow, the beginning of Jim Crow through to the civil rights movement. Those were not only stopped by the police, with a very few exceptions. There are a couple of cases where you can find police protecting defendants, male, female, pregnant, you name it, right?
At risk to themselves in some case where they were killed for doing it too, right?
Exactly right.
But exceptional, not common.
But exceptional, almost certainly aiding and abetting the extrajudicial killing of Black people on the basis of their race. Yeah. So you look at that history, you look at the terrible things that went on in the civil rights movement, and what was done against people. And the salt in the wound for many people was, if you remember, the civil rights workers, and there were many. There were Viola Liuzzo. There were whites who were involved. What was interesting, always, I think, for people in the civil rights movement, was the incredible attention that the death of whites got vis-a-vis the death of Black civil rights workers, and the national attention and response that they would get. So you add all of that up, and then you add, in the current context, the sense that people have been saying for a very long time, there are problems here. There are things going on that are not right. There are police reports that are being filed that are not factual. There are allegations of defendants being armed that are not true. The thing that has kind of broken the dam has been cell phone cameras. And whether it's the Walter Scott case, where we saw the officer put the doggone gun on the dude as he's running, right? To other cases like the body camera, or the camera in the case of Laquan in Chicago, shot multiple times by a police officer, basically just getting out of the car, and so on. So I think what's now happened is that that's really begun to break open the discussion, because people are saying, I've not been hallucinating this. I've not been delusional about this. I've been saying this for decades. There's a problem here. And so I think that's the context in which so much of the current debate and discussion occurs.
And you made an interesting point that I've heard from African Americans before, is this, and I go back to the Freedom Riders, and that was a case where the police, in one case, the police killed 3 people. I think one was African American, 2 were white, if I remember it right. Mm-hmm. That was the police doing that in that case. Now, we talked about their exceptions. That's not every police officer, but in that case it was. And the common comment at the time was, now people pay attention to it because a white person was killed.
Right.
And there seems to be, I think it's hard for us to accept that that's the reason now we paid attention. But it's also hard not to recognize, well, that is when we paid attention. That is a common thing I've heard. And so I want to give you a chance to comment on it, that not saying not every police officer, but in general, Blacks today are still viewed as less important in the eyes of the law than white people. Am I saying that fairly?
I think there's very much the sense that there is a very different standard for the treatment, as you say, not in every place and in every situation, but in the aggregate, there's a different standard of treatment if you show up in a court as an African American or a person of color, and if you may show up as a white person. And that's not to say that injustices are not done to whites; they are. It's not to say that justice is never served to people of color. It is, right? I think that the perception is very much that the aggregate experience is very different. Who gets a second break? Who gets the maximum as opposed to the minimum? Whose mitigating circumstances are taken into account? All of these sort of things. Who gets arrested sometimes as opposed to being put into an alternative approach?
And Ray, could you separate that out and say, well, actually, some of what we're perceiving in race in those kinds of scenarios is really class, that poor people.
Oh, no question about it. You're absolutely right. The challenge becomes, even when you control for class, you still find differences, right? So you're absolutely right. Class, I'm a big proponent about this because I think as a nation, we're even worse talking about class than we are about race, and that's hard to imagine, right? But the issues of class are significant. What's likely to happen for me as a pastor, as someone who's had multiple years of education and engagement with the system, is going to be very different than it is for a kid coming out of the neighborhood in which I live, but who's got a whole set of different circumstances. And what's likely to happen for my children is very different. So the issues of class absolutely are intermixed. They would say intersectionality is kind of a big term people use, intermixed and intersecting with that in all kinds of ways. But there are lots of areas in which we can, I think, show pretty well that even when you control for class and income and others, there's a racial dimension that doesn't go away.
And so let's talk a little bit about data, because what I think we see is there's data out there about this, and we're interpreting that data different ways, and I'm sure it's through our perspective and our lenses, and in some cases we just think differently about stuff. Right. But if we look at the data, about 1,000 people a year are shot by police, and that's a little bit of a ballpark average because it fluctuates year to year. And so 1,000 people a year are shot by police. In the cases where we know the race, because race isn't always reported, but in the cases where we know the race, 25% are African American and 50% are white. And we're just going to keep it, we're going to try, as complex an issue as, we're going to keep it simple by just keeping it to that. And I hear people interpret that data two different ways. I hear some people say, well, African Americans are 13% of the population, 25% of the victims of shooting, and therefore that is evident the system is racist, police are racist, and African Americans are treated differently by police. I hear other people say that, well, when you adjust it for crime rates, and Black participation in crime is about 25 to 50%, depending on what crimes you count, then actually Blacks are disproportionately lower in representation in police shootings. Is one side right or the other, or is the framing all wrong? How do you think about it?
I think the framing is completely wrong. And I'm not saying the way you said it, I'm saying what people don't say. And if you go back through all those papers, I think pulled up a number of good ones. And then I went back and actually looked at some of the source material. And in some cases, I know the people. I'd say the biggest problem is we have terrible data. If you look at any of these studies, these national surveys, they will tell you we are basing this on 40% of police departments reporting. and those reports are voluntary. Or we looked at 5 urban centers in a particular state. One of the problems is we have terrible data on criminal justice in our nation. And it's in part because it is so deeply decentralized. We have, I don't know, thousands of local police departments. The FBI tries to aggregate that data and use it, but as I look at it from paper to paper, researcher to researcher, you can try to draw some conclusions, but I don't know what you do when you have, I would call in some respects, such a poor data set. In 2015, I think journalists started an effort to really try to uncover all of these shootings by really combing media reports. And I think that's one of the better ones that we have. Even there, the problem is we don't have enough of the contextual data to really know who was armed, unarmed. I mean, a number of other things. So part of the problem here is, if you ask me, we have terrible data, not just bad, really terrible data for drawing conclusions about the equity or even the inequity. And what I think you end up being left with are kind of cases that really stand out for people that correlate with some of the data actually around non-lethal cases, where in fact, I think the evidence is better and a little stronger for a racial component. In the area of lethal or shootings, it's, I'd say at best equivocal, but our data is not, I think our data is not very good.
And so, Ray, when you say that, then are you meaning, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but are you meaning that actually African Americans are shot at a higher percentage than we realize because the data is bad, or that African American participation in crime is lower because the data is bad, or something else?
Well, I'm saying a number of several things. Many people's concern is that situations that in other communities get handled outside of the criminal justice system get handled inside of that police involvement. And this, again, this is why we get back to these issues, for example, of the police addressing homelessness, being involved in mental health, a number of other places, that situations that in other communities are dealt with other kinds of resources end up being addressed by police in communities of color. That's one aspect of it, that decisions that are made for engagement in the criminal justice system are different in those communities. But then I think the data sets that we have are the best we've got. I'm just saying, I don't think they're terribly good. They don't give us enough information from my vantage point to have great confidence in them.
And so I can hear some of my Republican friends, and I have Republican Democrat friends. I always say I'm an anarchist, but now that we actually have anarchists, I'm not sure I want to say that anymore.
Oh boy, you're really in trouble.
But I can hear them saying, well, hang on though, Ray, African Americans vote disproportionately for Democrats and live then in Democrat-run cities. And so if you have a problem with being treated differently based on race where you live, that's a Democrat issue. Leave me out of it. Is that fair?
No, I mean, I don't think so.
Okay.
This is a problem in blue states, red states. It's a problem in cities. It's a problem in towns. It's a problem in rural communities. African Americans do, without question, live a higher percentage in cities, but that's not the only place they live. And the problems aren't, I mean, if you just look over the issues that we've looked at most recently, these are not all democratically run cities. And that's exactly why, in a way, people are saying this isn't political racism, this isn't Republican racism, it's systemic racism. It's kind of baked in the way that the system operates, almost in some respects independent of who's running the city. Last thing I'll say on this, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I think people have become deeply concerned about the police unions, because they're complete. I mean, in many instances, it has nothing to do with who's Democratic or Republican mayor. This is a union that's representing its members. So the notion that this has something to do with party, to me, seems pretty anomalous. This is just, it's a kind of, and I'm sure that's not what people's intention, but it's a way of not addressing the fact that we have a big issue. And there are people in the mental health community who would raise the same issue. There are people in the educational system who would raise similar issues, not so much around shootings per se, but other kinds of bad interactions in terms of engagement with the criminal justice and law enforcement system.
And if I go back to what you said at the beginning about justice, as a believer, maybe as a secular person, I can get away with wash my hands of it, right? I'm not involved, it's not me. But as a believer, I don't get that luxury, right?
That, and also as a citizen, you're funding this. I mean, I would argue, one, you're just not getting very good results for a large amount of money. This is the biggest item in most budgets, or maybe next to roads or something. It's one of the biggest items for your educational budget.
Oh, yeah, schools probably
way up there.
Right,
yeah, schools are probably first, right? Maybe roads or maintenance and that sort of thing, but it's way up there.
Yeah,
you're paying for this, and I'm not saying everything that takes place is bad, but there's a lot that could be much better, and frankly, I think could be much better for a lower cost.
Yeah. And so I do want to bring up some of these challenging things that I hear.
Sure. I mean, these are the questions I think we got to wrestle with and talk with.
And so I don't want to suggest for a minute that if somebody resists arrest, that should give police the license to kill that person.
Absolutely.
Right? So just foundational point. But one point I have heard a number of times is there is a commonality in a number of these cases that we've been talking about over the course of the last year, at least, where people are resisting arrest or not cooperating with the police, and that escalates into a shooting. So we still wouldn't say that's just, but what would you say to the person who says, well, all they have to do is cooperate with the police and they wouldn't have had an issue?
Well, there are all kinds of reasons for which people don't cooperate with the police, and I'm not saying that those are right or good. In some cases, it may be fear, right? I mean, again, depending on where you are and what you are afraid might happen to you once you're in the custody of the police, that can be a reason for which people resist. And that's actually interestingly been recognized by some courts, I think, including the Massachusetts Supreme Court, I believe Massachusetts Supreme Court. But beyond that, that's human behavior, and we've invested, I think, an enormous amount of money quite rightly, into non-lethal forms of restraint, right? So, tasers are not completely, risk-free. They can also kill you in the right set of circumstances, but on balance, they're much safer than a gun. If you got a taser, I want you to use your taser, not shoot the guy, right? We've got other kinds of things, pepper spray, mace, you name it, right? Other ways of restraining people. And that can even include, if you don't feel that you have sufficient backup, get the license plate, as I think is part of people's training, keep them under surveillance, call for backup, respond with appropriate numbers of people. You just don't have to shoot and kill people.
Right. What was your reaction to the case? And I forget what state it was in, because I'm picking up on this taser point, where you have a police officer who apparently, according to the video, believed she had her taser and actually has her gun and shoots someone. Now, some of us would say, hey, those feel differently, right? How can you confuse them? But in the heat of the moment, right, if I want to give the benefit of the doubt, I'm not saying we should, but if I want to, right? I could see heat of the moment. And it seemed like she was genuinely surprised that she had shot him on the video. But how did you react to that?
I have to say, in some respects, with a measure of sympathy, in the sense that I agree with you. As I'm listening to that, I'm hearing somebody who realizes they've made a terrible mistake. Not trying to justify it, not trying to, just realizing they made a terrible mistake. And that then comes back to me to two things, one of which is training, because part of what training has to do in the context of people who have the ability and the authority to deprive people of their liberty or their life by the decisions that they make. Right? They really have to be trained how to remain calm. In fact, the more troubled the situation becomes, the calmer they need to become. Right? And if people don't have that, or they lose that, this is not the job for them. So I think part of the problem is we have, in some cases, people in the wrong jobs. If you can't remain unbelievably calm and focused under life-threatening circumstances, because that's what you're going to be facing. Now, it's not the largest part of your work. People have looked at this, less than 5% of police work, I'd say it's probably less than that, are these kind of situations. But those are the situations you can't get wrong. And that's what you're training. It's another reason for me why I don't need you to train them to interdict homeless people and kids, this unruly kids. I need them focused on this. I need them focused on the fact that white or Black or Latino, Latinx is a police officer, you may carry biases that will make you unconsciously stop one driver and not another. I think you've got class biases, right? You're going to stop the raggedy car, not the Mercedes-Benz, right? I need you to be focused on that, because if justice is going to happen, so that we don't end up with the kind of situation in Ferguson as the subsequent report showed, where in essence, the criminal justice and law enforcement system becomes an additional tax on the people who can least afford it, writing of citations and so on. I need you to be very aware of that, because you are, in most people's instances, the most visible evidence of the society's application of justice. You are, right? Not Congress or the law. It's you on the street. That's how people feel or don't feel that they're being treated fairly by the larger society.
And I know I'll forget some of my questions now, because you got like three in my head, and by the time I ask one, I forgot the other two. But how then what would your response be? Because I've heard this before too. What is your response to, well, Ray Hammond, right? We just make assumptions that because you're different than me, right? You're going to think of this a certain way because everybody thinks the same way, right? And so Ray, you're so upset about police violence. But I don't hear African-American leaders speaking out about the killings in Chicago, where it's predominantly Black on Black killing. And so this is political, right? It's not about really justice.
And to that, I would say, I appreciate the honesty of your question, because it really displays a kind of ignorance. And I don't mean that pejoratively. You don't know. You have no idea. I spent 30 years working on gang violence in Boston.
Yeah, I know.
It was our first community outreach, because I came from a neighborhood that had been really wrecked by gang violence. First thing we did was actually to start that work. We are part of, in Boston, a process that got the greatest reduction in violent crime of cities in Boston. And that was a consequence of clergy and lay people and churches working with police. That's why I know all this stuff about police.
Right. And so that was the start of the 10-point
that was exactly
coalition.
The 10-point coalition, which still is going on. So you don't know about that. I get that, because that's not in your world. That's not in your orbit. This issue of violence isn't what you care about. It doesn't affect you. So you have no idea what's going on, and you think nobody's responding to it. And in fact, it's been going on for decades. Mm-hmm. I could say the same thing in Chicago. I know the people, individual churches, organizations that have worked on this issue for decades. And there's seasons when they have, I think, real success and impact documented by research. And then there are other seasons when the work kind of gets overwhelmed for a lot of different reasons. But lots and lots of people working on this. And I get that you don't know it because violence isn't a part of your life. But the fact that you don't know it doesn't mean it's not going on. That's the first thing. And the second piece is you should understand that you're probably not going to get to know it in nearly as much depth as you do the violence when it occurs, because that's the way our media, in a sense, operates. If it bleeds, it leads. Nobody is going to interview me over and over and over again about the work that we're doing to prevent violence. They just don't. Nobody interviews people about the great good news. I mean, again, we got a lot of attention in kind of the law enforcement and criminal justice world. 400 jurisdictions from around the world came to visit Boston to look at what they were doing. We work with people not only across the country, but people working with neo-Nazi skinheads in Germany, or favela gangs in Brazil, and so on. But you're not going to know about that because this isn't your world, and it's not what you care about. So again, as I say, I mean, I hear people's response, but usually what it reveals is it's just not something you know about because it's not your world. It's not your issue.
And we're making a mistake when we assume what the media covers as what the narrative is the actual narrative of what's happening on the ground with people.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a nice story. It's a feel-good story, but you're not going to keep playing that over and over again. A juicy shooting, a killing, a bad gang weekend, you're going to hear about every one.
And I assume there's a nuanced difference. I remember talking to a friend about this one time too, and it seemed that there is a difference in that I kind of expect gang members to kill people. I expect police to provide me with safety and protection. And so there's a nuanced difference in that one feels worse than the other, even if there are more of the other killings.
Absolutely. I'm hoping that the police are kind of helping me, prevent this other kind of violence, right? I mean, there are limits to what, in a sense, I can do as a citizen. So I need on my side people who are going to help pursue that safety and security. Because frankly, I mean, I know people look at this differently. I don't want to arm the entire community. I don't think that's the effective way to do it, right? I think the community as a whole should be trying to get at some of the root causes, trying to provide alternatives. And when people don't take those alternatives, my hope is that the criminal justice system and law enforcement get them to a place where I can apply a prison ministry, right?
You're just making me think of something else. I remember another African-American friend, we were talking one time, and we were talking about the issue of Black people being arrested in New York because they're being stopped and frisked. And regardless of what you think about that whole policing process, it reduced crime, but it wound up with arresting a lot of people. Specifically because now I get stopped and I've got a gun, and so now I get arrested. And his view on that is, well, I carry a gun because of where I live. Yep. And I can't get a license to carry a gun, but I need to carry a gun, and I'm doing it for self-defense. And I just get mixed up with everybody else who's illegally carrying a gun. And so are we creating, that was one person, so I don't know how pervasive that is in your experience. Are our gun control laws then creating criminals who otherwise would not be?
I think this is a problem. I do know a lot of people who do carry weapons for defensive purposes, right? Now, I wouldn't take that a posture. That's not my approach, right? As a person of faith, I just don't think it's the best way to deal with it. But I get people have their fears and their anxieties, and so you're right, and they're no longer eligible to carry a weapon. Many people would say if you go look up the case of Philando Castile, who actually had a license to carry and ended up getting shot. And so people say, I don't know if it helps you, right? So you've got, I don't think it's the best way, but I get why people feel that, and that contributes to it. I'll give you another example of this. Rightly or wrongly perceived, this sense of the differential. The perception is that when drugs were seen as primarily a problem for the nation, but particularly in communities of color, the response was the war on drugs. As it now has become much more pervasive and even in smaller communities, it's seen as a public health problem. And so the response to the opioid crisis versus the crack crisis in the 90s, rightly or wrongly, seems for many people a perfect distillation of the difference in how, as a nation, we respond. And that's not perfectly racially driven at all, right? But again, I think that there is a sense that race is an important lens through which policy and practice get filtered.
And that it's an interesting point because I would draw the distinction. I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but I would at least draw the distinction that one is the result of a prescribed medication versus the other one was never a prescribed medication. Right? And there was a lot of support from even the Congressional Black Caucus when we started really going after crack cocaine.
But I'm saying that it wasn't all OxyContin. The opioid crisis was an opioid crisis. It included heroin. It included.
Oh yeah. Okay. Fair point. Fair point.
Yeah. No, I mean it's not just, and heroin at one time wasn't. Right. So I mean the fact. So one could say, well, it's kind of exhaustion, and we're realizing that approach is just not going to get us where we need. It's great at filling our prisons. It's not terribly good at actually dealing with substance use disorder or actually helping communities to become whole. So again, I mean, I'm only suggesting again, there's very much the sense that this is the lens through which things get filtered.
Yeah, I think we can both agree for sure that if we had a war on drugs, we've lost it. Right, because it's been terrible. It's only gotten worse. Now we're just legalizing it, throwing up our hands because we want the revenue from it, right?
That'd be another discussion. I don't see that we've learned a lot. This is a kind of, in some ways, a replay of temperance, right?
Yeah.
With devastating consequences for some communities.
Well,
devastating.
Families all over the map, right? Are being destroyed by it, and we're, I'm sure we're going to look back at what we're legalizing with drugs now, and some other things we're doing, just like we're looking at some of the stuff that started 50 years ago, and go, okay, that was actually a mistake, right? We're going to look back at this stuff and go, yeah, that was a mistake, but we're going to pay an awful price before we get there, and then it's hard to correct them, to reverse the policy, right?
And I will say, to Richard Nixon's credit, when he first proposed the drug legislation, I think it was roughly equal prevention and enforcement.
Yeah.
And for a series of political reasons, it became essentially all enforcement and just a rump tail of kind of prevention.
And there's a huge piece of, I think, of the war on drugs that or actually just the use of drugs, that as much as some of us claim to care about justice, when we want our drugs, we don't care about justice in Central America, right? And what it does to families and communities and people down there.
Absolutely.
Because we want our drugs. Right?
Yep.
Sorry, that's a editorialized. I get to
No,
preach every once in a while.
Great point.
Let me give you one more before we wind up, Ray, because we're getting down to the wire. And so we've seen a big crime spike since the protests around George Floyd being killed. And so I don't want to say, hey, we shouldn't have protests when something is done wrong. But it seems to have resulted in this, what people call the Ferguson effect, of now, because there's so much publicity around it, the cops start to pull back from really proactive policing. And now crime rates spike, and the people who pay the price are the poorest people again, as usual. Mm-hmm. And so do you see that? Would you agree with that characterization, or would you see it differently?
You know, I'm always, and this is again just from 30 years of working in this area around criminal justice and violence and so on. I'm always a little hesitant to attribute causal factors until we look at it a lot more deeply, because in a pandemic context with all kinds of economic consequences and overlays, to say nothing of all the political turmoil which we find itself, I'm a little concerned about a simple attribution to police pulling back. I'm sure police are pulling back. We've seen this before. But I don't know. I mean, as I say, that I don't quite know yet what to make of that. I don't know, you know, there was I think to my recollection, a kind of quiet in the early part of the pandemic season. The crime actually kind of tamped down for a period of time. I don't know whether people were afraid.
You go outside. How you going?
That's exactly right. So much harder. So I don't know if this is catch up, right? Things that I would have done, I'm sort of catching up with now. I don't know. Okay. And that's why I'm saying I'm in this area. I think attributing causes. We often attribute causes that outstrip what in fact we really know.
Yeah. As long as it affirms what I believed when I walked into the conversation, I'll take it. Right.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. For that, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, Ray, thank you again so much for being with us today and for talking about what I think are tough questions. These are not questions I hear people posing to each other. And so I appreciate you letting me pose them to you and for being so gracious in responding to it. I was concerned about this conversation. You made it an easy conversation. I'm grateful to you.
Well, you know, these are the conversations I think we have to have. And I think we have to have them, as I hope we've tried to have them, both with, I think, a measure of humility, right? We certainly know our own personal experience, but to try to extrapolate that across everybody's experience is both dangerous and, I would say, inadvertently arrogant. One. Two, to I think, recognize, as you say, it's ultimately an issue of justice here, and the justice that we want for everyone. And to recognize that I think any system put together by humans is going to have problems with sin and corruption and inequity. And our job isn't to try to sit back and defend all of that and prove that it's not the case. Let's take an honest, hard look at it and then figure out how do we do it better. Because that's what I think God calls us to. You should know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And I think we have to be at the forefront of being willing to just wrestle with it, and to be honest, to be able to say at times, look, we don't have good information. Let's do the best we can with what we've got. But again, as I say, I just see people backing into corners. I understand anger on both sides. And let's hear that. Let's give people the space and place to vent that. But then to understand, we got to get beyond that. If we're willing to listen and hear with our hearts and our heads, I think we can actually move forward on this.
Yeah, I think you make a good point on the humility and the conversation we see out in the world. People are rarely approaching a topic with, there might be something I don't know, and I might be wrong about something.
Mm-hmm.
And in the church, that shouldn't be a challenge for us to approach a topic that way, because we're called to be humble. In the same sentence, we're called to do justice, right? We're called to walk humbly. And so you always do that. I try and do that. so I appreciate you so much, Ray, and I appreciate you giving us your time and your wisdom again today.
Great to share and look forward to future discussions.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks again. For our audience, I'd like to thank them. I hope you heard something in this that you affirm, and I hope you heard something in this you don't agree with, and are okay with that. And maybe just be thinking about that and ponder that and pray about that. And maybe you'll think differently about it. But I hope if not, you at least understand the person who disagrees with you about it a little bit better. And so I'd also like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton. And our next podcast, we will have Brandon Cobb, who's the executive director at Renaissance Church in Harlem, talking about faith and work with us. We almost always have New England people on our podcast. Brandon, we give special grace to as being a New Englander, even though he's from New York. We decided that's close enough for our purposes.
Reconciliation is in the cards. We can have a New Yorker on a New England podcast.
Yeah, we don't talk sports though at all.
That would be a bridge too far.
Amen. Amen. Thanks again, Ray. See you all next time.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.